Hi there, I'm Mark Isero, and this is the Highlighter Podcast. Hello and welcome to the 26th episode of the Highlighter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. This podcast is an opportunity for us to talk about the best articles and podcast episodes on race, education, and culture. And I'm really excited about today's guest. On the show, we have Alvin Chang, and he is the senior graphics reporter at Vox. And if you've been following the newsletter, you'll know that I have featured him a couple times in the last couple weeks. This past week's newsletter has his piece on the long-term effects of growing up and living in poor neighborhoods. And 2 issues ago, there was his piece about school resegregation. And that's the topic of today's interview. Alvin Chang is just really good at explaining through data and cartoons and history how some of the most intractable issues of our day come not from chance, but actually from real decisions that we make day to day, and that there is something that we can do about it. So I am very excited to have him on the show, and let's get right to that interview. Thank you so much for being on the show, Alvin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Alvin Chang. I am a senior reporter at Vox. We do kind of explainer journalism. And my specific role there is covering policy in a way, in a visual way, but in a way that kind of explores a lot of the incentive structures in a way that is very data driven. Because I think a lot of times when we read the news, we struggle to think critically about what's actually happening and kind of fall into either partisan catchphrases or fall into kind of accepting what our tribe is saying. And so the goal for me is to figure out a way to essentially teach people more critical ways of thinking about these issues.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to talk more about that. But before we do that, is it okay to step back and just talk a little bit more about your journey, about how you got to Vox, and specifically also your passion around explanatory or data journalism?
Yeah, of course. So I started out wanting to be a Metro reporter, essentially being one of those people in Spotlight, the movie. And unfortunately, I graduated at a time when the economy wasn't great. And my first job was as a hockey writer at ESPN. And one of the very challenging things about that first job was figuring out how to add value to the content without having access to, say, coaches or players or general managers. So I started digging through a whole bunch of data and teaching myself how to ask questions of the data that are productive. And that's kind of how I first got into data journalism is wanting to answer questions without having access to the people to answer those questions for me. That kind of evolved into using the data and communicating that data to other people in a way that's concise and clear. I went to grad school at NYU in this program called the Interactive Telecommunications Program. And there, I thought a lot about how do we communicate using we have all this new technology and these new communication mediums. How do we use those things to essentially teach our readers about concepts that they often don't have very much context for? So after grad school, I went to worked at the Boston Globe, worked with the people who actually were in the Spotlight movie, which was an incredible experience, and then went to this place called the Connecticut Mirror, where we're covering state house policy out of the state house. It's a small nonprofit, and throughout all this entire time, the thought process is there's a lot of policy that kind of shapes the underlying bumps and incentive structures that we don't necessarily teach or talk about when we do our journalism because it's really hard. But that context ends up being the most important thing. It teaches us kind of ways to think about some of the most important issues of today. And it often explains some of the disagreements we have. We don't have that same shared history of why to think about something or equity in a certain way. So that's kind of how or why I chose to work at Vox. Vox was a place where teaching and context and explaining things that seem to not be explained in other places was valued. And I think you see it in a lot of my work where I'm literally they end up being history lessons of a sort because the new part of the story is a very small chunk, but I want to make sure my readers have the proper context to think about why something is unfair or why something is not being done in a smart way or why something isn't equitable. And so I think that's kind of where my passions lie is teaching with the hope that it provides the proper context for people to take in new information critically. As I'm talking, I'm realizing maybe I should have been a school teacher, but I, it's been a really interesting process because I think a lot of it is kind of a newer endeavor where I'm trying out certain things and seeing how they work and trying out other things and seeing they don't work at all.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I also appreciate your emphasis of context. And I do agree with you that we have all of these mental ideas and maps based on sort of our own lived experiences and background. And I do notice the same thing in your work is that there is always a history lesson. My question is on this piece, which focuses on connecting perhaps political gerrymandering with what happens in school districts, as well as school desegregation and resegregation efforts. It seems to be a big interest and passion of yours. Where did that come from? Is it something that you've been interested in for a while, or is it more a newer thing for you?
So I think one of the most fascinating things about looking at segregation patterns is it gives you kind of the shadows of the geography of the incredibly racist and exclusionary and discriminatory policies that the U.S. Had not that long ago, and still have to an extent. And I think what's really difficult for folks to wrap their heads around is how do those policies that we all kind of look back on and say, well, those weren't right. Those weren't equitable at all. What's really difficult is connecting those policies with today, to say, we're 50 years removed from, say, the Fair Housing Act, or we're X number of years removed from, about 50 years removed from the civil rights movement. And we're 50 years removed from, or 60 years, I guess, from Brown v. Board. How do those things continue to affect what is happening, the racial inequities that exist today? When we look at segregation, it's just incredibly apparent. And we can see both the contours of housing segregation. We can see both the contours of Brown v. Board. We can see that even though separate but equal was ruled unconstitutional, we can see all these incentive structures that were built up that have yet to be torn down and continue to segregate our schools. So I think that's why I write about school segregation. It's and I think the kind of other side of this is, your listeners probably know this better than most, but the American education system is not a meritocracy. It often has structural biases that perpetuate the inequalities that exist. So if you're a upper middle class person, chances are your kids will be upper middle class people, and a huge portion of that has to do with the American education system, everything from K-12 to higher ed. And so I think when you combine those things together, you combine the importance of education in the transfer of wealth through generations, and then you combine the contours of our very racist past and essentially trace that directly to where we are today to say, hey, this still exists. I think that should help us think, well, this isn't fair, and B, think, well, this is not only not fair, but it's really wrong. I guess that's one big point. but the other thing is think, okay, well, what can we do here to make this a more equitable system? It gives you the framework to think about things like redistricting. It gives you frameworks to think about things like charter schools and private schools. Because I think without thinking about those ideas or thinking about this context, if we just take everything in a vacuum and look at where we are now, we can just say, oh, well, why don't we just give everyone a fair, why don't we just give everyone an equal shot and treat everyone the same? And it's, the answer is because we haven't treated everyone the same. And here we are today. And so I think that connection, it's really important to make that connection direct and concrete. And I think that all comes to a head in this this idea of or this concept of school segregation and this phenomenon that continues to kind of bleed into virtually every part of the American education system.
Yeah, I appreciate the direct link and also the history and the storytelling. But when you come to say a thesis, that our educational system is not a meritocracy and that there's structural bias, that's something that I also believe in, and probably many of listeners believe in. My question is, as a data journalist, a lot of folks wanted to know how you take on a large data set. How did you get to a place on this piece?
I think it makes sense to kind of talk about how this piece came to be. I first wrote about school segregation, or wrote a bigger piece kind of on this issue, I would say about 6 months ago. It was looking at school district secession, small communities within districts that wanted to create their own districts. They tended to be whiter, more affluent communities, and they wanted to kind of hoard their resources and keep it within their own district bounds, or their new district bounds, I suppose. And after I did that piece, this researcher, Tomas Monares from UC Berkeley, he reached out to me and he said, "Hey, I've been working on this research. It relates somewhat to your piece. Do you want to talk about this?" And so I got on the phone with him. I talked to him about what he was working on, and I just thought, this is incredible. I was blown away by what he had been working on. And I think, we got lucky because we both spoke the same technical and conceptual language. We were both able to understand what we were doing, what our technical capabilities were, and what our kind of conceptual understanding of the issues were pretty much off the bat. So I guess that's how this project got started. The question of what to include and what not to include, this is always a tricky one for me because there's a lot that gets edited out. If I had an infinite attention span from my readers, then I would include a lot more. But, so I also teach an undergrad class, and I know that infinite attention spans are things of dreams that never exist. So, so I have to figure out, what is important here? What are the incentive structures that we need to explain? What are the historical factors that we need to explain? And when it comes to inequity in schools, I've written about this several times, and I've kind of boiled it down to be able to talk about both housing segregation and as it relates to migration patterns, as it relates to school segregation in a way that I think is tight and to the point. And so that's kind of it's been a work in progress, I guess. And I'm still trying to find better ways to explain this without going through, 6 Supreme Court cases and going through, 17 data points, which I have in the past. But I think it's important to talk both about kind of the actual events that happen, whether they're policies passed or Supreme Court rulings. And it's also important to show kind of the large scale data that shows you the bird's eye view of what it caused or what happened afterward. So I think that's where my use of data comes in, is trying to either get a bird's eye view or to drive home a concept. Because at the end of the day, you could look through a million different districts and find similar patterns of segregation, similar patterns of both housing and school segregation. But I think what made this data set so powerful was I was able to kind of show you, hey, look, it exists in your backyard too. It's not just some big concept; it exists in your backyard. And so I think this data set was especially kind of a double whammy of me being able to make something really visceral for the reader, but also give them this context of showing this historical data, showing the effects of policy, showing that it actually affects their current day situation.
Yeah, usually in explainers, it's either or. It's either the engagement interactivity, like here's your school district, is it better or worse? Or it's the history, or it's the cartoon. And I'm just very impressed with both the concrete and clear way that you have approached this, but also that it's not just one thing. And I think that that's what listeners have said and readers have said. They've said, yeah, it totally did keep me engaged, especially to question this idea. So I think that there is an idea that you challenged, that the only way to integrate is between school districts, and both by bringing up the 1974 Supreme Court decision as well as other things that you have in your piece. it seems like you want us to consider, not just parents, but also educators and district leaders, that there are additional ways to perhaps desegregate even at the district by district level. Is that what you were shooting for as part of your piece?
Yeah, I mean, we're left with such a weak tool to integrate schools, which is this intra-district effort. I bring up Milliken v. Bradley, the 1974 Supreme Court case, to show that it severely limited the ability of us to actually tackle the real kind of the larger scale segregation that exists in the underlying geography of where we live. But I wanted folks to really think, okay, here's what's left, and here's what we're doing with this small tool that we have left. And it turns out what we're doing is we're just letting the underlying segregation kind of fester and or even making it worse without actually challenging whether or not these decisions matter in terms of racial equity, in terms of any kind of equity. So I think that's, we often don't think too critically about, when we sit down to redistrict, I would venture to guess that a very small portion of school boards are thinking, oh, well, let me make sure that everyone on the board understands these Supreme Court decisions, these trends that are festering, make sure we understand racial equity when it comes to school segregation. I highly doubt that. I think a lot of times we just use kind of our intuitive maps in our head to decide, oh, well, this makes sense to put these kids over here. This makes sense to put these kids over here. And as it turns out, it's a pretty terrible way of making decisions, especially when there are these biases that are really hard to overcome without actually confronting them head on. So that's the charge that that's the thing that I want folks to kind of challenge themselves on, is asking themselves when they make these decisions, are we perpetuating something that are we, whether inadvertently or purposefully perpetuating something that hurts the most disadvantaged students in our schools? And I just don't think we think in these terms critically enough, I guess.
Yeah, I see that in your work, this idea of mental models and also maps in our head and challenging those. And I think that that's so crucial in education. I do also want to ask, though, because a couple of folks brought it up, is that there does seem to be sort of like a premise that you have that integration is the way to go. And I'm a huge fan, say, of like Nicole Hannah-Jones and her work, and I believe in integration. And yet I do see it as something that's actually being debated, whether there's no more will to have integration of schools or whether people are openly and honestly challenging it. Do you feel like it's something to bring up, or do you feel like it's not appropriate to bring up the potential question in your work about whether desegregation is the right way to advance educational equity?
So I think there are two questions here. I think one is desegregation is too hard. It's when you let the free markets reign, let everyone move where they will, let districts form where they will. This desegregation isn't going to happen. It's too hard. And to those folks, and I've heard this argument before, to those folks, I say, yeah, you're right. If we don't do anything, it's almost as if the metaphor I've used before is it's as if you pour ice cold water in a tub of bacon fat. It'll just start clumping together, and you'll start getting this segregation. That's kind of the natural state of how segregation has tended to work. There are many reasons for that, but I think, to say, okay, this is too hard is one thing. And to that I say, well, we got to try hard. The kind of underlying question is, why integrate, right? Why is it more equitable to integrate, or why is this something we talk about? And I think there's a lot of research that shows that our segregation policies are policies that segregated Black children from white children, that policies that segregated Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. A lot of that has made it difficult for Black families to accrue wealth. It has also put Black families in the cycle of being in ghettos and being unable to get out of ghettos that were created by racist policies. And we can see that in any data about intergenerational wealth, where you see that Black families just haven't accrued wealth at the same rate as white families and even Hispanic families. And so what we're essentially saying is we have put a whole race of people in and concentrated them in poor neighborhoods and made it difficult for them to accrue wealth. And that hasn't changed. And all the research shows that if you are concentrated in a poor neighborhood, your health outcomes are lower, your happiness is lower, your educational outcomes are lower, your economic outcomes are lower. Virtually, living in a poor neighborhood is in concentrated poverty is one of the worst things for your health ever. What worst things for your life. If we think that's not fair, that some people have to suffer those consequences because of where American policies put them, then I think, it's we need to actually think integration is something we need to think about. I mean, maybe you can think of other solutions, but I think that's where I'm coming from. Is when you force people to live in poverty, don't let them accrue wealth, and then all of a sudden 50 years later you say, well, what are you complaining about? It's that doesn't seem right to me, and the data seems to bear that out. So if we can kind of get out of this mindset of thinking, well, why are we trying to socially engineer a certain kind of integration or a certain kind of diversity, and get more into the mindset of how do we help all children we're all kind of products of the systemic biases that we've grown up in. And if we can kind of keep those in mind, I think we end up coming to this place of, well, integration actually, it turns out, is very important. It turns out a lot of policies that deconcentrate poverty are very important. It turns out a lot of policies that reduce violent crimes are very important. And I think those are kind of the models that I'm hoping to convey. And mostly because I think virtually all the research kind of bears out these mental models as being true.
Yeah. I want to thank you. I have one last question, if that's okay.
Yeah,
is it all right?
Of course.
Yeah, my last one is actually from a science teacher here in the Bay Area. And I think it's a follow-up about what he or any classroom teacher can do, given that, say most of his time is, with his students. His name's Jonathan, and he asked a question. The question is, should our focus as progressive educators be fighting for more integrated schools or focusing on more equitable, not equal, but equitable school funding policies? And I feel like I know your answer is probably toward integration, but as the last question, let's say that you are a classroom teacher and you have your students as they are, and let's say that perhaps it's not an integrated setting. What do you think what would you offer a classroom teacher about what to be thinking about, and then just sort of how to conceptualize the role in this?
I mean, I think I would generally lean toward integration, but that said, one of the lessons I learned time and again as I look through larger scale data sets is that so much of this is situational, and so much of it requires a locally tailored solution. And I think the solution in the Bay Area and kind of the models to think about this in the Bay Area might be very different than how we think about it in where I'm from in Kansas. So I guess that's kind of a cop-out answer. But I guess I would offer one other thing, which is that the teachers, and especially white teachers, have a political clout in a community. And I would say most communities in the U.S., they have a political clout that I think it's important to be aware of, and that creates a sort of responsibility. It's something that comes up often when I talk to folks of, why doesn't this community solve these problems politically? And the answer is, often the communities that are most vulnerable are those who are having kind of policies that the policies are acted upon them instead of policies that they are deciding. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. But I know it's a cop out to kind of go with the like narrowly tailored solution, but I think that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This was great.
Big thanks to Alvin Chang for being on the show. Everybody probably knows that I have really cared about this issue of school integration and school segregation, resegregation for a long time. And it's one thing to read tons of articles, which obviously I've done, and it's another thing to be able to talk and listen to an expert. So once again, thank you, Alvin Chang, for being on the Highlighter podcast. Before we go, I do want to say one more thing, which is I want to hear from you, your questions, your comments on the show, and I have a phone number for you to call to leave a voicemail. It is 415-886-7475. It's a Google Voice that'll go directly to voicemail. So leave any and all comments that you have about the show or a question for an upcoming broadcast. It would be really great to hear from you and also who's really, really focusing in on the show. So definitely take me up on this offer to give me a call. 415-886-7475. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you over at the newsletter at 9:10 a.m. this Thursday.